Hello, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Clarence Robinson. Today, I want to talk to you a little bit about Frederick Douglass. I'm currently a junior here at Troy University, studying hospitality sports management. Again, the reason I chose Frederick Douglass is because when we were young and we wore our afros, me and my friends would joke on each other, and we would say, if your afro wasn't combed or your hair wasn't combed, you look like Frederick Douglass. So when we was asked to do this great leader project, it was something that really stood out to me to do Frederick Douglass. Speaking of Frederick Douglass, it says he was very tall, not just in his 6'2" frame, but also in his stature as a leader. Seemingly a strong-looking man. Mr. Douglass was called many things, with one being the Lion of Anacostia. Also, he was called the Sage of Anacostia, the Sage of Cedar Hill, and also it was his lion-like mane or hair on his face that gave him this title, but also the life he lived that made people believe in the name, the Lion of Anacostia. Being born into slavery to his mother, Harriet Bailey, born in Tuckahoe near Hillsborough, about 12 miles from eastern Talbot County, Maryland. Mr. Frederick Douglass was born Frederick Augustus Washington Bailey. It was not until later he became or changed his name to Frederick Douglass. We will get into the reasoning why he changed his name to Frederick Douglass a little later on in the video. Excuse me. Thought to be born in 1817, he later found out he was actually born in 1818. But the exact date was not recorded, and this was common practice for slaves at that time. Mr. Douglass did not know who his father was, but it was believed to be his master, Aaron Anthony. Mr. Douglass passed away February 20th, 1895, of a massive heart attack or a stroke shortly after returning from a meeting for the National Council of Women in Washington, D.C. He was buried in Mount Hope Cemetery in Rochester, New York. During Mr. Douglass' early years, it was said he was treated like any other carefree child. Run around, have fun, and just get away with everything. He didn't even know he was a slave at the time. It was not until he turned 6 years old that he truly realized his destiny or fate that was laid before him of being a slave. Douglass was first asked to be the caretaker for the kids of his master. When he would not do this properly, he would be scolded and treated unfairly, as any other slave would be. Even though Mr. Douglass was very, very young, he realized something about the way he and other slaves had been treated, and he knew it wasn't right. This spark in young Douglass gave him the moment of knowing that he had to be free. Although his mother also was a slave, she did not live in the same plantation as Mr. Douglass. As a matter of fact, Mr. Douglass moved to another plantation where he learned to read and write by the mistress of the plantation. Now, she taught him how to read and write, even against the will of her husband. What kind of young man did she see in Mr. Douglass that she would teach him, knowing that she herself would get in trouble for him being black and teaching him how to read and write? Mr. Douglass had the wherewithal not only to that, but to be cunning enough to trick the young white children into letting them do his homework, because he knew ultimately the knowledge he gained from that homework, or knowledge he gained just for reading, would be his ticket out of slavery. According to my readings, it was not until the age of 15 when Mr. Douglass was allowed to go to work in Baltimore, not as a free man, but as a rented slave. It was at this time when he met his wife, working at the shipyards. Now, he didn't meet her at the shipyards, but he met in that time frame. Her name was Anna Murray Douglass. While working, he was allowed to keep a portion of his wages. And when learning about Mr. Douglass, I had no idea that slaves actually were rented out and could make money. I always thought they just worked on plantations, and that just kind of blew me away. His working on the shipyard proved to be pivotal in his life because it gave him the paperwork needed for his escape. Mr. Douglass, with the help of his future wife, Miss Anne Murray Douglass, planned his escape. With this information of being a shipyard, he ended up posing as a sailor and leaving and sailing north, where his wife, Miss Anna, later accompanied him. During his time in the North, Mr. Douglass met Mr. William Lloyd Garrison, who was an abolitionist. Once he met Mr. Garrison blew him away by the way he wanted to free slaves. And it's something inside of Mr. Douglass just struck, and it just magnified his wanting to be free and wanting to free others. Because although Mr. Douglass escaped slavery, he was not free. At that time in the United States, if Mr. Douglass was caught, he would be taken back to his master and put back into slavery. This was something that Mr. Douglass feared. And thus, he feared it so much that he ended up moving to England for 2 years. And while that time he was in England, Mr. Douglass did conventions. He went around and talked about different things and taught people, to the fact that he learned and got new friends in the area, and they learned of his situation. And they pooled their money together and freed Mr. Douglass from his master. They purchased him from his slave masters and owners. And therefore, that's how he became a free man. The reason he changed his name at the time is because if he would have went by his first name and got caught, that would have been troublesome for him. So therefore, he changed his name to Frederick Douglass during that time period. Some of Mr. Douglass' attributes was that he wrote 3 autobiographies. He also consulted with President Abraham Lincoln. He also served as a recruiter for the Union Army. Now, you're talking about a man leading his family and leading others. His oldest sons also joined the Union Army following their dad and what his works that he wanted. Mr. Douglass was also the first African American nominated for vice president. Mr. Douglass also was the first African American to receive a vote for the United States of America. It was only 1 vote, but still he received it. Things and stories like this are what made me choose Mr. Douglass. Mr. Douglass fought through any excuses that he could have had. There are many things he could have made or said or done because he was a slave, but he chose to be free. And not only did he get himself free, but he wanted to free others. And Mr. Douglass fought for women's rights and rights of others up until the day he died. So it just makes me feel like we have no excuses. And for him to be a black man and me to be a black man, this was really resonant for me. It really was something that stuck strong with me. And it made me realize that there is no excuses we can have, and there's a quote that I live by as well. And it's excuses are the enemy of excellence, the marks of mediocrity, and the forerunner of failure. The trigger to achievement is enthusiasm. Mr. Douglass didn't make any excuses because he was a slave. And he was enthusiastic about freeing slaves and women's rights. And so therefore, it led him to having a great life. A life of, yes, hardships, a life of, yes, struggles, but yet a life of triumph. And that's why we in 2020 can speak about his life this day. I thank you, and I say, have a great day. Goodbye.